I always thought our marriage was unshakable, like the kind of bond you only see in old movies, simple, enduring, and filled with unspoken trust. But the truth hit me like a bolt of lightning, tearing through everything I believed. It started on an ordinary Tuesday when I came home early from work, hoping to surprise my wife, Lauren, with dinner. I'd even picked up her favorite wine. The house was oddly quiet. Normally, Lauren would have music playing or the TV on, but today there was nothing except the faint murmur of voices. No, not voices, laughter. A man's laughter. It drifted down from upstairs, soft but unmistakable. At first, I thought it must be the TV. But as I stepped into the living room and saw the television off, my stomach tightened into a knot. Maybe it was a plumber or a contractor. I knew Lauren had been talking about fixing the bathroom sink, though she hadn't mentioned anyone coming today. Still, something felt off. I called out, "Lauren." No answer. The knot in my stomach twisted tighter. The laughter stopped abruptly. I stood at the base of the stairs, listening to the deafening silence. A part of me wanted to leave, to pretend I hadn't heard anything. But another part, stronger, angrier, propelled me forward. Step by step, I climbed the stairs, the creak of each board underfoot amplifying the tension. At the top of the stairs, I noticed our bedroom door was slightly ajar. My heart pounded in my chest as I approached, every instinct screaming at me to turn back. But I pushed forward. I needed to know. I pushed open the door. And there she was, Lauren, my wife of 10 years, in bed with a man. But not just any man. The man was my father, Paul. The air left my lungs as if I'd been punched in the gut. For a moment, I couldn't speak, couldn't move. I just stood there, staring at the two people I trusted most, caught in the most revolting betrayal imaginable. Lauren scrambled to pull a robe over her bare shoulders, her face a mixture of guilt and panic. Paul, on the other hand, remained calm, leaning back against the headboard as if he had nothing to apologize for. "Jake," Lauren began, her voice trembling. "It's not what it looks like." Her words snapped me out of my paralysis. I laughed, a bitter, hollow sound that filled the room. "Not what it looks like?" I repeated, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding me. How could this be anything but what it looks like?" Paul finally spoke, his voice dripping with arrogance. "Calm down, son," he said, his tone patronizing. "There's no need to overreact." Overreact? My vision blurred with rage as I took a step closer. "You don't get to tell me how to feel, Paul," I spat. "You betrayed me. Both of you." Lauren burst into tears, whether from guilt or manipulation, I couldn't tell. "Jake, please," she pleaded, stepping toward me with outstretched hands. "I didn't mean for this to happen. It's just, you've been so distant. You're always at work, and I felt so alone." Her words felt like knives. "So your solution was to sleep with my father?" I shot back, my voice rising. "You couldn't talk to me, couldn't tell me how you felt?" "No, you went straight to him." Paul stood then, his face hardening. "Don't put this all on her," he said, his tone cold. "You're never around, Jake. She needed someone, and I stepped up. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with your failing business, you'd have seen this coming." I stared at him, disbelief warring with fury. "You're unbelievable," I said, my voice low and shaking. "You call this stepping up? You seduced my wife, your own daughter-in-law, and you think you're some kind of hero?" Lauren interjected, her tears now replaced with defiance. "You don't understand, Jake. Paul makes me feel appreciated, valued. He's successful, confident, everything you used to be before, well, before you started failing." Her words struck harder than any punch. This wasn't just about intimacy, it was about power, money, and her shallow, selfish needs. My father, ever the opportunist, had exploited my struggles to worm his way into her life, and into my bed. For a moment, I considered retaliating, yelling, throwing something, maybe even hitting Paul. But then I realized that would give them exactly what they wanted, proof that I was the unhinged, unreliable one. No, I wouldn't stoop to their level. I took a deep breath, forcing my voice to steady. "You two deserve each other," I said, each word laced with venom. "Enjoy your little fantasy while it lasts." Turning on my heel, I walked out of the room, ignoring Lauren's sobs and Paul's smug silence. As I descended the stairs, I felt a mixture of heartbreak and fury bubbling inside me. But beneath it all, a cold, steely resolve was forming. They had betrayed me in the worst possible way, but I wasn't going to let them ruin me. Not yet, at least. The days after the discovery were a haze of anger and disbelief. I stayed in a cheap motel at the edge of town, too disgusted to step foot back into the home we'd shared for years. I hadn't spoken to Lauren or Paul since the confrontation, but I knew it was only a matter of time before one of them tried to twist the knife further. That time came on a rainy Thursday evening. My phone buzzed with a text from Lauren, "We need to talk." Against my better judgment, I agreed to meet her at a nearby cafe. I wanted answers, though part of me knew I wouldn't like what I heard. She was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee. Her eyes were red and puffy, but her posture was composed, almost calculated. She gestured for me to sit, offering a small, forced smile. "Jake," she started, her voice soft and tentative, "I'm glad you came." I leaned back in the seat, crossing my arms. "Get to the point, Lauren. Why am I here?" She sighed, her fingers fidgeting with the handle of her mug. "I owe you an explanation," she said, her tone dripping with practiced sincerity. "I know what I did was wrong. But it's not as simple as it looks." I scoffed. "Isn't it? You slept with my father, Lauren. What's complicated about that?" She flinched at my words but quickly recovered, her expression morphing into one of wounded indignation. "You don't understand, Jake," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound genuine. "It's not just about intimacy. Paul, he supports me in ways you never could. He understands me." My stomach churned. "Supports you?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You mean financially, don't you?" This wasn't about love, it was about money. Her silence spoke volumes. She looked down, her fingers still toying with the mug. "I'm not saying I don't care about you," she mumbled, barely audible. "But you've been struggling for years, Jake. Your business is failing, and I felt like I was drowning. Paul offered stability. Security." My blood boiled as her words sank in. This wasn't remorse, this was justification. She was trying to rationalize the betrayal, to paint herself as the victim. "So, because I had a rough patch, you decided to jump into bed with my father?" I shot back, my voice cold. "That's your idea of support?" Tears welled up in her eyes, but they felt as fake as everything else about her. "I didn't mean for it to happen," she said, her voice breaking. "It just happened. We were spending time together, and—" "Stop," I cut her off, raising a hand. "Don't insult my intelligence, Lauren. Affairs don't just happen. You made a choice." She looked at me then, her tears falling freely. "You pushed me away," she said, her voice quivering. "You were so focused on your business, on trying to fix everything, that you didn't see what I needed." I shook my head, a bitter laugh escaping my lips. "What you needed? What about what we needed, Lauren? I was killing myself to build a future for us, and you were sneaking around with Paul." Her expression hardened, the tears drying as quickly as they had come. "Don't put this all on me," she snapped. "You were never home, Jake. I was lonely, and Paul—" "Don't you dare," I interrupted, leaning forward. Don't you dare paint yourself as the victim here. You betrayed me, Lauren. And not just with anyone, with my own father. Her face crumpled, but I didn't feel an ounce of sympathy. I didn't plan for this to happen, she whispered. It's just. Paul makes me feel appreciated, valued. He believes in me. I stared at her, incredulous. You're unbelievable, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. This isn't about appreciation. It's about greed. Paul has money, and that's all you care about. Her eyes flashed with anger. It's not that simple, she insisted. You think I don't love you, but I. Stop, I said again, my tone final. Just stop. Every word out of your mouth is a lie. You don't love me, Lauren. You love what Paul can give you. She sat back, her face pale, her lips trembling as she searched for something to say. But I'd had enough. I stood, throwing a few bills on the table for my coffee. We're done here, I said, turning to leave. Jake, wait, she called after me, desperation creeping into her voice. I paused, glancing back over my shoulder. I made a mistake, she said, her voice cracking. But we can fix this. I still love you. I shook my head, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. No, Lauren. You love yourself. And now, you can live with yourself. I walked out of the cafe, leaving her behind. Outside, the rain had picked up, soaking me within minutes. But I didn't care. The storm raging inside me was far worse. That night, I started digging. I pulled out old bank statements, credit card records, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what had been happening behind my back. The more I uncovered, the angrier I became. Lauren hadn't just betrayed me emotionally, she'd been draining our joint account, funneling money into a private fund. And Paul had helped her. It was all so calculated, so cold. They'd built their little fantasy world on the ashes of my trust, and now they expected me to roll over and accept it. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. The night after my confrontation with Lauren, I lay awake in the sterile, impersonal room of my motel. Sleep felt impossible. My mind replayed the past few days in an endless loop, Lauren's excuses, Paul's smugness, the weight of betrayal. Every time I thought I'd reached the bottom of my anger, another wave dragged me deeper. But somewhere in the early hours, amidst the swirling emotions, a thought emerged: I couldn't let their betrayal ruin me. If I gave in to the despair, they'd win. That realization settled like a stone in my chest, heavy but grounding. The next morning, I started digging. I went to the bank first, requesting a full audit of our accounts. The banker, an older woman named Diane who had known Lauren and me for years, raised an eyebrow when I asked for statements dating back a year. "Everything okay, Jake?" she asked, her tone cautious. "Not really," I admitted. "Just, need to get my affairs in order." The pile of documents she handed me was overwhelming at first, but as I combed through the transactions, a pattern emerged. Large, unaccounted-for withdrawals were scattered across the past several months. The money hadn't gone to household expenses or anything I recognized, it had been funneled into a private account under Lauren's name. The account didn't exist before last year, and every transfer bore the unmistakable signature of someone helping her set it up. That someone was Paul. The audacity of it hit me like a punch to the gut. Not only had they betrayed me emotionally, but they'd also stolen from me, money I'd worked for, saved for, all while I scraped by trying to keep my business afloat. It wasn't just betrayal anymore, it was calculated theft. I confronted Paul later that day. His office, located in one of the tallest buildings downtown, screamed wealth and power. The receptionist looked startled when I walked past her without announcing myself, but I didn't care. I was beyond caring about decorum or appearances. Paul was sitting at his massive oak desk when I barged in. He didn't look surprised to see me, in fact, he smirked, leaning back in his chair as if he'd been expecting this. "Jake," he said, his tone condescending. "I was wondering when you'd show up." I closed the door behind me, the slam echoing in the cavernous room. "We need to talk," I said, keeping my voice calm despite the fury simmering beneath the surface. Paul gestured to the chair opposite him. "By all means. Let's talk." I didn't sit. Instead, I placed a copy of the bank records on his desk, the highlighted transactions glaring up at him. "Care to explain this?" I asked, my voice cold. He glanced at the papers, his expression unreadable. "You've been busy," he remarked, sliding the records aside. "I assume Lauren's name is on these accounts." "You know damn well it is," I shot back. "You helped her set them up, didn't you?" Paul didn't deny it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Lauren came to me for help," he said, his tone casual, as if we were discussing the weather. "She was struggling, Jake. She felt trapped." "Trapped?" I repeated, incredulous. "You mean trapped in the life we built together? Trapped in the marriage she vowed to honor?" He shrugged, his indifference like a slap to the face. "Marriage is complicated. Sometimes people grow apart. She needed stability, and you weren't providing it." I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay composed. "So you thought you'd swoop in and save her?" I said, my voice low and dangerous. "By betraying your own son?" Paul's smirk deepened. "Business is business, Jake. Love doesn't care about rules." His words hung in the air, each one dripping with arrogance. I stared at him, the man I once looked up to, and saw him for what he truly was, a predator, someone who saw people as tools to be used and discarded. "You're a disgrace," I said finally, my voice calm but firm. "Not just as a father, but as a man." Paul's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. "You can think what you want," he said, his tone dismissive. "But Lauren made her choice. And frankly, Jake, you've always been too soft to keep what's yours." His words cut deep, but instead of lashing out, I nodded slowly. "Maybe you're right," I said, surprising him. "Maybe I have been too soft. But not anymore." I turned on my heel and walked out of his office, leaving him behind. My heart was pounding, but my resolve had never been clearer. They wanted my life. They could have the wreckage, the scraps of what they'd destroyed. But they wouldn't get the foundation. They wouldn't get me. That night, I began putting my plan into motion. First, I contacted my lawyer. I explained everything, the affair, the stolen money, the accounts, and she assured me we had a strong case. "But you'll need to act fast," she warned. "People like Lauren and Paul don't go down quietly." Next, I started separating myself from the mess they'd created. I froze our joint accounts, ensuring Lauren couldn't drain another cent. I updated my will, removing Paul as a beneficiary. Every connection I had to them, every financial or legal tie, I severed. As I worked, a strange sense of calm settled over me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I had control. Lauren and Paul had underestimated me. They thought I'd crumble under the weight of their betrayal. But they were wrong. The next day, I began packing up my things. The house, once a symbol of our life together, now felt like a hollow shell. I didn't want it anymore, not with its memories and ghosts. My lawyer assured me I had a strong claim to keep the property, but I had other plans. I didn't need to hold on to a past that had already been burned to the ground. As I loaded the last box into my car, I glanced back at the house one final time. It was strange, feeling nothing but relief as I turned away. They could fight over the ruins if they wanted, but I was moving forward. I wasn't going to let their betrayal define me. They thought they'd won, but they hadn't seen the last of me. Not by a long shot. The day after my meeting with Paul, I walked into my lawyer's office and officially filed for divorce. Lauren thought she'd blindsided me, but what she didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment for months. Her erratic behavior had tipped me off long before I caught her with Paul, and I wasn't about to let her walk away with everything I'd built. My lawyer, Ellen, was sharp and efficient. "We'll move quickly," she assured me, her pen flying across a legal pad. "You've documented everything, the affair, the financial misconduct. The court will see this for what it is." That afternoon, I froze our joint accounts. Lauren had already drained a significant amount, but the rest was now untouchable. She wouldn't get another cent from me. I also filed an injunction to stop her from selling any of our shared assets. By the end of the day, she was effectively locked out of our finances. The fallout came fast. Lauren called me that evening, her voice sharp and shrill. "Jake, what the hell is going on? I can't access the account." I kept my tone calm. I froze it. "You've taken enough. You can't do that," she shrieked. "I need that money, Jake. How am I supposed to survive?" "You should have thought of that before you betrayed me," I replied coldly. "This is your mess, Lauren. Clean it up yourself." She launched into a tirade, calling me every name in the book, threatening to ruin me in court. I stayed silent, letting her words bounce off me like arrows against armor. Her tantrums didn't faze me anymore. She was grasping at straws, desperate to regain control. But the more she raged, the more her mask slipped, revealing the entitled, selfish person she truly was. Next, I turned my attention to Paul. Cutting ties with him was harder, not emotionally, but logistically. Despite everything, he was still my father, and disentangling our lives took time. We shared investments, and he still had a minor stake in my business. But I was determined to sever every connection. I walked into his office unannounced, just as I had days before. This time, he didn't look smug. He looked wary, as if he knew why I was there. "Jake," he greeted me, trying for his usual charm but falling short. "What can I do for you?" "You can stay out of my life," I said flatly, dropping a folder on his desk. Inside were documents transferring his shares in my business back to me. "Sign these." He glanced at the papers, then back at me. "You're serious?" "Dead serious," I replied. "I don't want your money, your influence, or your name attached to anything I do. You're dead to me, Paul." His face fell, the bravado crumbling for the first time. "Jake, you're overreacting. We're family." "Family?" I interrupted, my voice icy. "You don't get to use that word. Family doesn't do what you did. You're a parasite, Paul. You preyed on my wife, used my struggles against me, and now you're paying the price." For once, he had nothing to say. He picked up a pen and signed the documents without protest. When he finished, he looked up at me, his expression hollow. "Is this really how it ends?" "It ended the moment you betrayed me," I said, turning to leave. "Goodbye, Paul." As I walked out of his office for the last time, I felt an odd sense of relief. Cutting him out was like shedding dead weight. For years, I'd tried to earn his approval, to live up to his impossible expectations. Now, I was finally free. Lauren, meanwhile, was unraveling. Without access to our joint accounts, she was forced to rely on Paul. But his generosity had limits, and it wasn't long before cracks appeared in their arrangement. One evening, I got a call from an unknown number. I hesitated before answering, and when I did, Lauren's voice came through, frantic and desperate. "Jake, please," she begged. "Can we talk? Just for a minute." I didn't respond right away. Hearing her voice was like reopening an old wound. "What do you want, Lauren?" I asked finally. "I need help," she said, her voice cracking. "Paul, he's not who I thought he was. He's controlling, manipulative. He's cut me off. I almost laughed at the irony. And you thought I'd care because I made a mistake, she cried. Jake, I was wrong. I see that now. I should have never. I cut her off. You think I'll save you now? After everything you did? You chose Paul, Lauren. You made your bed. Lie in it. She started to say something, but I hung up. I'd wasted enough of my life on her. From that moment on, I ignored her calls and messages. She was someone else's problem now. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly. Ellen ensured that Lauren's actions were front and center in court, and the judge was unsympathetic to her crocodile tears. The evidence was damning: her infidelity, her financial mismanagement, her blatant disregard for our marriage. By the end of it, she was left with nothing. When the final ruling came down, Lauren's face was a mask of disbelief. She had expected to walk away with half of everything, maybe more. Instead, she got nothing but the clothes on her back and the bitter reality of her choices. As I left the courtroom that day, I felt an odd mix of emotions: relief, closure, and a lingering sadness for what could have been. But above all, I felt free. Lauren and Paul had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had only destroyed themselves. In the weeks that followed, I sold the house and moved to a new city. I started fresh, rebuilding my life piece by piece. Lauren and Paul were out of my life for good, and I intended to keep it that way. The last I heard, Lauren was bouncing between friends' couches, trying to find someone to take her in. Paul's business had taken a hit as word of his personal life spread, tarnishing his once stellar reputation. They'd both gambled, and they'd both lost. I, on the other hand, had won, not just the legal battle, but my life back. I stood in the middle of my new home, a modest one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city, and took a deep breath. The air here felt different, cleaner, lighter, untainted by memories of betrayal. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe again. After the divorce was finalized, I wasted no time selling the house. That place, once filled with so much hope and love, had become a monument to lies. Every room, every piece of furniture, seemed to carry a memory I didn't want. It felt cathartic to hand over the keys to someone else, knowing I would never have to walk through those doors again. Lauren and Paul were gone from my life, and I intended to keep it that way. I had no interest in their drama or their downfall, but word traveled fast in small towns. The last I heard, Lauren was struggling. When the court ruled in my favor, leaving her with nothing, she turned to Paul for support. But the very man she had betrayed me for had lost interest. Paul's resources were vast, but his patience was not. From what I was told, their relationship soured quickly when the novelty wore off. Lauren, once so sure she'd landed on her feet, was left scrambling, calling old friends and distant relatives for help. Most of them had heard the story by now and weren't eager to take her in. Paul didn't fare much better. His reputation, once pristine, was tarnished by whispers of what he'd done. Family friends shunned him, and business associates distanced themselves. In the world he lived in, image was everything, and his image was now irreparably damaged. For a man like Paul, that was a fate worse than losing money. As for me, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy starting over in a new city, but it was liberating. I found a small office space downtown and began to rebuild my business. Without the weight of Lauren's deceit and Paul's shadow hanging over me, I found a clarity and focus I hadn't felt in years. Slowly but surely, things began to improve. One evening, as I unpacked the last of my boxes, I found a photo buried at the bottom. It was from a happier time, Lauren and I at the beach, arms wrapped around each other, smiling at the camera. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest tightening. Then, with steady hands, I tore it in half and dropped it into the trash. It wasn't anger that drove me, it was acceptance. That chapter of my life was over, and it was time to let it go. Months passed, and with each day, I felt stronger. The scars Lauren and Paul left behind didn't hurt as much anymore. Instead, they became reminders of what I'd endured and overcome. Their betrayal had forced me to confront myself in ways I never had before. I realized that I had spent so much time trying to prove my worth to others, Lauren, Paul, even my community, that I had forgotten to value myself. Sitting on the small balcony of my apartment one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. My revenge wasn't just about taking back what was mine, it was about reclaiming my dignity. It wasn't about crushing them, though they had certainly done a fine job of that on their own. It was about standing tall in the aftermath, knowing I hadn't let them destroy me. Every now and then, I wondered if Lauren ever thought about what she'd lost. Did she regret what she'd done, or was she too consumed by bitterness to care? Did Paul feel the weight of his choices, or was he still clinging to his arrogance, pretending he hadn't wrecked his own life? It didn't matter. I didn't need their apologies or their remorse. Closure didn't come from them, it came from me. From the decision to walk away, to let them sink in the mess they'd made, and to focus on building a better life for myself. The new life I built wasn't extravagant, but it was honest. I made friends in my new city, people who valued me for who I was, not for what I could give them. I started going to the gym again, taking care of myself in ways I hadn't in years. I even started dating, cautiously at first. Trust was a fragile thing, but I was learning to let people in again, little by little. One afternoon, while walking through a park, I saw a father and son playing catch. The boys' laughter filled the air, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sadness. Paul had stolen more than just my wife, he'd stolen the idea of family, of having someone to rely on. But then I reminded myself, family isn't always about blood. It's about who shows up, who stays, and who truly cares. The last I heard of Lauren and Paul, they had gone their separate ways. Lauren was living with an old college roommate, trying to piece together a life without the support she had taken for granted. Paul had moved out of state, retreating into obscurity. They had gambled everything on their selfish desires and lost. I didn't feel sorry for them. They had made their choices, and now they were living with the consequences. As for me, I had chosen myself. I had chosen to rise above the wreckage, to build a life free from their shadows. Sitting in my little apartment, the sun setting over the city skyline, I realized I was finally at peace. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. And that, more than anything, felt like victory.